It's wild. It's a whole different world. But it's great to meet you. Thank you for taking a minute out. I love delving into the macro, micro of podcasting. So I want to begin our conversation with, 4 years ago, the pandemic began and we were trying to wrap our heads around it. And of course, one of the byproducts that came out of the pandemic was that podcasting became this huge hip thing.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, how did you survive the pandemic and how did it change the way that you do things?
Well, I started, back in 2005. So for me, it's just a way of life. It's something I do. The interesting thing was everybody started a podcast. Most of them started it using a free service, which was the thing that kind of drove me crazy is there was a lot of what we were kind of jokingly calling podcast litter, where you would see the show and they'd have one episode, you'd click play and you'd hear, I don't know, it's blinking, I think. What test is it? Yeah, oh, it's working. Yeah, good. And that was the episode. Like that was it. And
Wow.
so all these people have like, okay, well, I'm home with the kids. I'm going crazy, and so a lot of people started podcasts, but that then also inspired them to maybe should go listen to some, and it drives me nuts. So, like, I have a friend of mine that kind of last year was like, man, you're always talking about this podcasting stuff, and he's like, when I went to listen, he goes, most of these are really bad. And I go, yep. I go, welcome to my world. I said, and part of the problem is Joe Rogan got $200 million and makes it look like if you just talk to your friends for 3 hours, you'll get paid. And I go, that's not really how it works. I go,
Yeah.
Joe Rogan got that payday 36 years after he jumped into the entertainment field.
Yeah.
And I go, and his friends are famous. And I go, so talking to your best friend, isn't it? But yeah, it's so the pandemic was interesting. We everybody got there were a ton that started, and then when it came, you'll see if you go in and you're like, oh, I was going to do a show about whatever dog grooming, and I see there's already a bunch of shows about dog grooming. I'm always like, go in and look and see when was their last episode, and a lot of them are in like 2021, 20 late 2020 or whatever. So it inspired a lot of people, which is great. And I think overall it helped because really what podcasting needs are more listeners.
Yeah.
And so it kind of inspired that as well.
Well, I'm always encouraged when I listen to people, they talk about they do have a good podcast diet. It's almost like an audiobook for them. It's almost like what we used to call terrestrial radio. It's definitely something that's out there. But you being a consultant is probably a pretty prime position to be in right now with a lot of people needing direction, whether with branding or audio or whatever it is. So I'm curious if I put you in front of a bunch of third graders right now at career day, and one of the kids asks you, "Hey, what do you do for a living?" How do you answer that child?
I would say I help people who they're very passionate about a subject and they want to get their subject more exposure. And so they want to reach a global audience. That's real. I mean, without getting into bandwidth and microphones and is YouTube a podcast and all that other nonsense, it's like in the end, because you need passion when you first start off, because everybody worries about the audience. Oh my gosh, I've got to get this right because I have the audience. And I'm like, you don't have an audience yet. You're talking
Yeah,
to, 13 people if you get your cousins to listen.
yeah.
And so it's a matter of you have to figure out why am I doing this? Because if you don't get your why, you burn out. You have to figure out who you're talking to, because if you're not going to entertain them or educate them, they're not going to listen. And so you have to figure the hard part is the what, and the what is where you overlay the why and the who. And so it's what can I talk about that's going to keep them engaged while slowly moving them to whatever your why is.
So how did this journey begin for you? Actually, before we get into the journey's beginning, when you were in the third grade, what did you want to be when you grew up?
Anything that didn't wear a suit.
Okay.
I was basically I was the youngest of the family, so I was like a little 5-year-old hippie. Because my older brothers and sisters, like I was the only kid in first grade when Jimi Hendrix died that knew who Jimi Hendrix was. And I went to school and I'm like, did you guys hear who Jimi Hendrix, he died? And they're like, what's a Jimi Hendrix? So I was always like this little baby hippie. And I don't know why. I think because we weren't we weren't officially poor, but we definitely weren't rich. I had to, and my dad taught me if you wanted any money, you had to do something for it. So wash the car or something like that. And so just to me, I think I had a bad taste in my mouth for super rich people because I don't know how they got there, but doggone it, you have more money than I do, so I was envious or whatever. So I was the guy with the lemonade stand. In junior high school, before there were vending machines in schools, I would go to the local market and buy some gum and sell it by the pizza by the slice. It was gum by the by the stick, and it was just anything I could do to generate money. And then later, of course, there came the paper routes and working at grocery stores and things like that. But yeah, anything that wasn't a suit. In fact, that used to drive me. I always thought I wanted to fix things. My dad was into electronics and he had a bunch of stuff. He had a big workbench, and I was always like, I remember when I fixed a old reel to reel deck
Oh
that
yeah.
my grandfather had, and it was interesting because I take it upstairs and I don't know who I'm listening to. My grandpa died when I was 3, and I put this reel on and I go, "Look, mom, I fixed this." And I hit play, and I watched my mom just melt and cry and run out of the room. And I'm like, I'm like, "Mom, what did I do? Did I say something wrong?" She goes, "No, that's my dad's voice. I haven't heard that in X amount of years." So it just totally freaked her out. So I always thought I wanted to fix stuff, and I did. I have a degree in engineering. I was a copier technician for years, and I was horrible at it. And luckily, the guy that hired me said, "Hey, we have a position we want to give you. You're going to go out and train people how to run the equipment after you set it up. So you use your technical skills to set it up, and then you're there to show them how to run it." And he goes, "But really, what you're there to do is to explain to them how not to run it, like no paper clips through the bypass and things like that." And so that's how I got into training and did that for about 8 years. Ended up teaching people Microsoft Office and QuickBooks and time management, and was let go from that job and went to get a job back in teaching. And they're like, "Yeah, your degree's in engineering." And so I had to go back to school at the ripe old age of 42, where all the students are like, "Are you the teacher?" And I'm like, "No, no, I'm a student," and got my teaching degree, and did that for another few years. And again, teaching a lot of Microsoft Office and all this other stuff. And when that finally went away, I'd been podcasting already for 10 years. And I was like, man, I'd like to get a job in podcasting somewhere. And
Yeah.
I'd already been running the school of podcasting, and that was just like a super serious side hustle, and I was gonna do that full time. And then my now ex-wife said, "No, no, no, you need to go get a job." And so I was lucky enough, the podcast worked as a resume, and I ended up getting a job at, Libsyn, which is the original, the OG of, podcast media hosting. So I've been there for 8 years now.
Wow, that's amazing. So, do you think seeing your mom's response to that interview or that the sound of your grandfather's voice, do you think somewhere in your brain that became a part of you wanting to get into podcasting? What was the catalyst?
Yeah, I think it's something. It probably more cassette decks. I remember my grandparents bought one, and I have tapes of me where it's me and my grandma playing radio. We were WHOME, and my grandma asked me, "What's your favorite subject?" And I go, "What are subjects?" And she goes, "Studies." And I go, "Oh, recess." Yeah. She was like,
Of
"Recess is your
course.
favorite." So I was always playing with cassettes. And I remember once when we finally got our own cassette deck, and I bought my grandparents over, so I had 2 cassette decks, and I would go into the bathroom, and I have a tape of me somewhere singing the Beatles "Yesterday,"
Yeah.
and then I would basically play the tape and record it on another one and sing harmony. So I was
Ah,
always one of my other hobbies is music, so I was always playing with that. And then later when little 4-track machines came out for musicians, I had one of those, and then later I went to reel. So I've always, between audio and in 6th grade, I kind of thought I wouldn't mind being a writer. And so I think the combination of being a musician and playing an audio, I've run the sound system my church since I was like 13, because I was in a band at that point, so I knew how to turn the knobs and stuff like that. So I think the kind of the technical side and then the creative side came together. And what really put the pin in it is I had been writing a newsletter for musicians about how to get CD sales and get more gigs and things like that. And a friend of mine had come back from a marketing conference, and this kind of dates me. He goes, "You know how you missed the MySpace boat?" And I go, "Yeah, yeah, don't rub it in." He's like, "I seen the next big thing." And I go, "Great, what is it?" And he goes, "Podcasting." And I went to Google, I typed in podcast, I typed in podcasting. Didn't matter what I typed in, 1.5 pages. I was like, "I think we broke the internet." I go,
yeah.
"There's just nothing on this."
Yeah.
And so when I finally pieces parted one together and I uploaded one and then saw it come down in the software, I was like, oh, wait a minute, this is going to be global. And so I just took my newsletter that I was doing and started putting it out as a podcast.
Yeah.
And I'm going to say it took 2 weeks, and I got a voicemail from this guy named Michael Van Laar from Nuremberg, Germany. And I was like, I'm in the middle at that point of nowhere, Ohio. I was in Mogador, me out there in the cows. And I was like, wait a minute, there's another guy on the other side of the planet that not only found my show, but liked it. And I
Yeah.
was like, oh, okay, now I'm like, it's going to take a while, but I really think this is going to change the world. And it has.
That's a great story, man. So I'm curious, as someone that mourned the loss of Jimi Hendrix and obviously being a music aficionado, what was
Yeah.
the first concert you ever saw that blew you away?
Well, it's funny because some of my first concerts I was dragged to because of my older brothers and sisters. Like I
Yeah.
saw Glenn Campbell, Barry Manilow, but the one that was my first concert, it was hard to top. It was in 1978. It was the World Series of Rock with Aerosmith and Ted Nugent. I was a huge Ted Nugent fan because I was a guitar player growing up.
Yeah.
And then they had AC/DC with Bon Scott, um, Thin Lizzy. Journey was just out with Wheel in the Sky. And then at the very last minute, they tacked on some band that nobody had ever heard of from Germany called the Scorpions. And when Angus Young came out, just completely bonkers out of his head, running around and falling down on this, and I was like, I want to be that guy.
Yeah, of
That looks like a
course.
lot of fun. And so, yeah, I mean, it took a couple years, but thanks to my paper route, I got the exact same guitar he did,
Yeah.
and that's I just actually just did an episode on the School of Podcasting about that. I said a lot of this is your attitude because I was like, instead of like, oh, I'll never be as good as him, I was like, the notes he's playing are on this guitar somewhere.
Yeah.
I just need to find them. And so with podcasting, there are things like it's your content, it's your delivery, might be your pacing, might be this thing called luck, but we're all trying to put the pieces together till it finally really resonates with your audience. And then hopefully they tell two friends who tell two friends who tell two friends.
And then it just spreads from there.
Yeah.
So what is the motivation for you to continue to do this? We all know, I mean, I know pretty well being in podcasting. I've been in this since 2013. When you've been doing this for a long time, it has to be a passion project. But what gets you out of bed? What motivates you to come up with new content and to continue to help others get to that place?
Yeah, I think it's whatever the gene is for teaching and serving, that's somehow in me. And I think part of that, I remember my dad was a long distance truck driver. So he was gone about 4 days out of a week. I would see him on the weekends, which basically meant me watching him sleep. And I remember I was at some sort of church picnic, and it was a three-legged race with all the kids. It might have been Father's Days even, and he had already headed out to the road. And I just felt like the outsider looking in. And so that's part of it to where I think everybody has a message and they go, I don't know how to what's a RSS feed and all this other stuff. And just 2 nights ago, I helped a couple, and they're probably in their late 60s, maybe early 70s, but they didn't grow up with computers. They don't know technology. And it took them a while, but I was walking them through. And by the end of the call, we had submitted their show to Apple and it already showed up.
Wow.
And watching them go, I go, look, go ahead and search for your show. And they go, oh, there it is. And I go, click play. And I hear their voice come out of their phone. And they just got these huge grins on their face. And they're like, there we are. Like that's us. And for me, the payoff of that of people going, oh, I could never do this. And then watching them do it, and they're going, oh, I guess I can. And then they're like, well, what's next? I go, it's time for episode two. Like
Yeah.
you did one, let's do another one. I said, and now it's easy. It's all set up. And I just got to keep doing another one. I had a woman who had a tremendous business background, and she called me up and said, I want to start a podcast, but I can't do it because I hate technology. And she called me up on the phone crying. And she's like, "Dad," I'm like, what's wrong? She's like, I'm in Apple. And I go, yeah, I walked you through submitting yesterday. She's like, no, I'm in Apple. And just couldn't believe she did it. So that kind of stuff just puts a ton of gas in my tank.
And
I mean,
and
it's
though no, I'm sorry, go ahead.
well, I mean, and it's fun for those people. Like for me, the best use of podcasting, I mean, there are many, but especially on the money side of it, if you can use it to promote your own, like if you create a show where you're your own sponsor, that's by far the most profitable thing. So that's fun too, because that's like shooting fish in a barrel. That's,
Yeah.
podcasting is not easy, but that's one where they're like, hey, I got my first order. And I'm like, yeah, you created a podcast that your target audience would listen to. I'm
Yeah.
like, that works on paper and it works when you do it.
So you've established a couple eureka moments, and I'm curious for you, what was that moment for you? I can tell you for me, I remember interviewing Sonny Rollins for the first time, and that was
Mm.
like, wow, what was that moment for you of whether it was an interview or it was an episode where you're like, you had to step away and say that happened.
Yeah, probably two. And when I first started, my first show was for musicians, and I was interviewing because this is 2005. I grew up really in the 80s. And so I started interviewing musicians from the 80s because grunge had knocked them out. I'm
Yeah.
talking to the bass player of Quiet Riot, and I was a big Randy Rhoads fan. So hearing Randy Rhoads stories from Rudy Sarzo and Carmine Appice and Joe Lynn Turner from Rainbow, and I was like, holy cow. But the one that really made me speechless is I got this email from a guy and he said, "Hey, I just wanted to let you know, uh, after I had 20 years with my best friend and he suddenly died. And in that same time period, 20 years, I lost my job and I was pretty sure I had cancer. And I had decided that Halloween, which is my favorite holiday, I was going to take my gun and blow my brains out." And he goes, "But I heard your show and you said that sometimes having a podcast can give you a purpose." So I was like, well, let's start a podcast. And he goes, "I just want to let you know, I credit you with
Wow.
saving my life." And I was like, at the time, I'm literally in a basement next to a water heater, hoping the furnace doesn't come on,
Yeah.
talking about microphones and bandwidth. And this guy hits me with, "Hey, you saved my life." And I was like, what? Like, hold on. And so I've talked to people about that, and I have a friend of mine, Ken Blanchard, that does Black Man with a Gun and a couple other ones, and he's got a military background, so he occasionally, kind of slides that in that he used to work with that. So he's got a lot of veterans listening to him, and he goes, "I have 5 of those." He goes, "One guy literally called me from the roof, and he goes, 'I'm not trained to talk people off the roof.'" He goes, but he always says, at the end of his show, he goes, "Oh, and I want to remind you, I love you, and there's nothing you can do about it." And it must be that connection that he's had people call him. He's also a pastor, and I think
Wow.
that might have something to do with it. But
Yeah.
he was like, "Yeah," I mean, he goes, "I'm not trying to like one up you." He's like, but he goes, and I've been at events where that story will come up, and you end up with this connection with your audience that it's weird because you're just talking into this microphone and you're wondering if anybody's listening, and then you find out that you have this connection with people that
Yeah.
you go, "Oh, I didn't see that coming."
I think it's a modern version of therapy. I think a level of what we're doing right now is very positive, and there's so much polarity in our environments that we live in, especially in America now. So I think there's a way where I've realized we're more alike than we think we are, and to celebrate that uniqueness that all of us have as humans, going after our dreams and doing our things. I don't know that it gets any better than that.
Yeah, I mean, I know Haley Radke does a show called Adoptees On. And when I was talking to her, it's all about what it's like to be adopted because the
Hmm.
only people that know what it's like to be adopted are people that have been adopted. And she said, "Yeah," she goes, "We're all familiar with the after school special where, I've been searching for years and finally they knock on the door and they go, 'Mom,' and they're like, 'Oh my gosh, I've been.'" And he said, "That's not usually the way it happens." They go, "A lot of times people spend years looking for their birth parents only to get rejected again."
Yep.
And I was like, that hurts my heart just to say that. And they said, and the only people that can understand that are other people that have lived it. And so they have a Facebook group where they all meet. And yeah, it's one of those things where, TV and radio stuff, it's broadcasting. So we're talking about subjects that are a mile wide and an inch deep. Now with podcasting, you can find this super tight niche and go a mile deep and an inch wide. So
Yeah.
people are like, oh, I can't get this information anyplace.
Yeah. So of all of these things that you've done and evolved into and all these different incarnations of your career lineage, what are you the proudest of?
Boy, that's a good one. What am I proud of? I guess, hmm. I guess one, I just haven't quit. I've never thought about it, And the one that still kind of bounces off my forehead is in 2018, I was inducted by my peers into the Podcasters Hall of Fame. And so, a friend of mine called to let me know, and I'm like, "Are you sure you got the right guy?" And so that's just something where, it takes a lot of time and a lot of hard work and dedication and things like that. So to be recognized, it was like, okay, I guess I'm okay at this.
Yeah.
I don't suck.
Yeah,
So
for sure. That's
yeah.
that's amazing, man. So at the end of the day, as the man behind the mic, everyone has a perception of you, family, friends, listeners, but you run the show. What's your perception of you? Who do you think you are?
Oh, that's hilarious because we all have imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
I have a friend of mine and I was talking about different things of marketing the school of podcasting. He goes, "You know what your problem is, Dave?" And I go, "What?" He goes, "You don't know you're Dave Jackson." He goes, "Everybody knows you." He goes, "Everybody talks about you." And he goes, "You're sitting here in a room thinking nobody's listening." And so for me, I think I've always been, when I was teaching, and I still, I guess, teach via microphone, I've always dubbed it edutainment. I try to make people laugh while I'm educating them. And that just comes from I had a niece once and she was 3, and there's nothing better than a full belly laugh of a 3-year-old.
Mhm.
And I walk by and I go, "Emily, what are you doing?" And she said, "Roger Rabbit is teaching me reading." And I was like, she doesn't even know she's learning. She's just having a blast.
Yeah.
And so I've always tried to keep things light and fun. And I'm a little weird. I do really bad imitations of people. And people are like, "You do know that doesn't sound anything like." I'll do a really bad English accent, right? And they're like, "That doesn't sound like anybody in the UK." And I'm like, "Yeah, it's just me being weird."
Yeah.
And so I hope I entertain people while they're learning stuff. But for me, I that would be the word that comes up. If somebody said, "How do you describe yourself?" I go, "I'm a little weird."
So if a time machine pulls up in front of your house when we get off this call and you can go back in time and see one event in human history or go into the future and see what's going on, where are you going?
Ooh, I guess the future, because in theory, thanks to our good friend the internet, I can go back in time and kind
Yeah.
of see what's going on.
Yeah.
Although, the more we learn about the past, the more we're finding out that was often filtered
Yeah.
in a way.
Uh-huh.
But the future would be interesting because with AI, I just spent I was at an event in Cleveland, and the week before that, I was on an online event all about AI, and they say it's going to I think it's every 6 months, it's going to double in power.
Sure.
So whatever it's not doing today, it will in the future. So it's going to be interesting to see. And I just keep telling people, I'm like, lean into your humanness,
Yeah.
explain things with personal stories because ChatGPT can't do that.
Right. 100%. That's such sage advice. So if anyone wants to find out about your school, listen to your podcasts, anything about your world, where can they go?
Yeah, schoolofpodcasting.com is kind of the flagship. And then if you're like, "Well, what else you got going?" I have powerofpodcasting.com, which is just a bunch of links to my book and everything else that I've been doing. So those two will get you to me.
Right on, Dave. You're a pro, man. Thank you, sir. Thank you for taking a time out. It's been an honor. Best of luck with everything.
Oh, thanks for having me. This was great.
Yeah.